The probate attorney glanced at his screen, cleared his throat, and asked me to confirm something that made the room tilt sideways. According to the state database, I had been legally divorced from my husband for 4 months. I hadn't signed anything I remembered. I hadn't been to court. I was still sleeping next to the man every single night. My grandmother had just left me $40 million, and in the same breath, a stranger in a gray suit told me my marriage had already been quietly, legally erased. I stayed silent for exactly 5 seconds. Then I asked for a certified copy of every page. What I found waiting in that file wasn't just a forged signature. It was a plan years in the making, built by a husband who called himself my partner while draining my company from the inside, and a mother-in-law who had already picked out which of her sons deserved to inherit everything I built. They thought I'd cry. Instead, I opened a folder and I started keeping receipts. My name is Camille Ashworth. I was 36 years old, co-founder and chief executive officer of Meridian Bio, a biotechnology company headquartered in a converted red brick warehouse in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 20 minutes from the drafty 2-room rental where my husband, Grant Whitfield, and I had first started running late-night assay experiments on borrowed university equipment. The title sounded impressive at industry conferences. Investors loved saying it. Reporters loved printing it. But in reality, Grant and I had built Meridian Bio out of almost nothing. A single centrifuge that jammed every third use, a landlord who shut off the heat every weekend to save on his utility bill, and 2 people who believed, with the kind of foolish certainty only very young couples can afford, that love and hard work were the same currency. I handled the business side of things: investors, regulatory filings, partnerships, payroll, the endless parade of due diligence questionnaires that come with raising venture capital in biotech. Grant handled the science, the compound libraries, the lab protocols, the technical relationships with our contract manufacturers overseas. Colleagues used to joke, gently, that I was the spine of the company and Grant was the brain. I used to smile at that, quietly proud. What woman doesn't want to believe that she and her husband built something impossible together from absolutely nothing, side by side? From 2 people crammed into a rented lab bench, Meridian Bio grew into a 110-person company with a promising oncology pipeline heading toward a critical FDA pre-submission meeting. Bigger investors, bigger partnerships, our name finally carrying real weight in the Boston biotech corridor, mentioned in the same breath as companies twice our size and 10 times our funding. But a company with all its lights on does not necessarily mean the marriage running it underneath is warm. Some houses glow beautifully from the street and are freezing cold the moment you step through the front door. Grant and I had been married 9 years without children. For a lot of women, that single, unchanging fact becomes a splinter lodged so deep under the skin that it never fully heals, no matter how much time passes, no matter how many times you tell yourself it's fine. I had gone through 3 rounds of IVF at 2 of the top fertility centers in New England. I had injected myself with hormones in hotel bathrooms during investor roadshows, timing my shots around board meetings and due diligence calls, smiling through pitch decks while my body ached in ways I never once mentioned out loud. I had listened to specialists explain gently and clinically why my numbers weren't improving. I had listened to well-meaning friends offer advice that felt like tiny paper cuts, one after another, never quite deep enough to bleed, but enough to leave a permanent sting. And I had listened, most of all, to my mother-in-law. Patricia Whitfield came from old money Connecticut stock, the kind of family that measured its worth in trust funds and country club memberships rather than anything so vulgar as effort. She prided herself on being blunt, on just saying what everyone else is thinking, which in practice usually meant saying the cruelest possible thing at the worst possible moment and calling it honesty. At first, she played the concerned mother-in-law. "You work too hard, Camille. Stress does terrible things to a woman's body. No wonder you can't carry." I would force a smile and change the subject, though a lump would form in my throat that took hours to dissolve. At extended family dinners held twice a year in her sprawling Greenwich estate, she would announce, loudly enough for every cousin, aunt, and family friend to hear over the clinking of good china, "We have 2 sons in this family, and only one of them has managed to give me grandchildren. Some women simply aren't built for motherhood, no matter how many diplomas they hang on the wall." The table would fall dead silent for a beat, and then someone would laugh nervously to break the tension, and the meal would continue as though nothing had happened. People do that. If you say something devastating in front of a crowd, it gets waved off as an eccentric joke instead of the cruelty it actually is. Words are cheap to speak. The damage they leave behind costs a fortune to repair, if it can be repaired at all. Patricia's golden child was Grant's younger brother Teddy, Teddy to the family, always Teddy, never Theo, as though the diminutive kept him perpetually a boy who could do no real wrong. Teddy had never held a job longer than 14 months in his entire adult life. He drifted between vague consulting ventures and half-finished business school applications, living rent-free in a Whitfield-owned brownstone in Back Bay, driving a car his mother had gifted him for his 30th birthday, and somehow still receiving a standing invitation to every family trust distribution, every holiday gift basket stacked high with imported chocolates, and every warm word of encouragement Patricia could summon. 2 years before everything unraveled, at Patricia's persistent and increasingly pointed insistence, I had brought Teddy onto Meridian Bio's payroll as a business development advisor, a title with a 6-figure salary attached and almost no deliverables I could ever point to when pressed. I told myself I was being generous. I told myself family should look out for family, that a little nepotism never hurt anyone, that Grant's happiness mattered more than my discomfort. I had no idea how catastrophically expensive that particular flavor of generosity would eventually become. Whenever Grant saw me go quiet after one of his mother's comments, he would reach over and pat my shoulder, his voice gentle in the way that made you feel cared for, even as the substance of what he said left you feeling smaller. I believed him. I believed him so completely that when he started coming home later and later, smelling faintly of a perfume that was distinctly not the one I wore, I told myself he had simply been at partner dinners with clients who smoked or wore too much cologne themselves. I believed him so completely that he needed to pull all-nighters at the lab before a manufacturing audit. I only texted him reminders to eat something and not to drink too much coffee on an empty stomach. I believed him so completely that an entire architecture of lies could be constructed brick by brick around me, and I would only ever see the pleasant wallpaper Grant had chosen to cover it. The night everything finally cracked open began, of all things, with an ordinary call about my grandmother's estate. My grandmother, Eleanor Ashworth, had passed away 8 months ago after a long, dignified illness that she bore with the same quiet stubbornness she brought to everything else in her 91 years. Her estate attorney, a meticulous woman named Renata Cole, who had handled Ashworth family affairs for over 20 years, and who had once, memorably, made my grandmother cry with laughter over a contract dispute involving a neighbor's disputed hedge, asked me to come in and finalize probate. I assumed it would be a routine formality, signatures, an inventory of assets, perhaps a walk down memory lane with an attorney who knew my grandmother longer than I'd known most of my own friends. I had no idea I was about to learn 2 enormous things within the same 60 minutes, that I had just inherited $40 million, and that I had been legally divorced from my husband for 4 months without ever knowingly signing a single divorce document in my life. The rain that morning in Boston came down in long gray sheets, the kind that make the entire city smell like wet pavement, old brick, and the roasted coffee drifting out of every corner cafe. I sat across from Renata in her downtown office on the 11th floor of a building overlooking the Common, a thick manila folder resting on the polished desk between us, like a held breath. An associate attorney handling the state filings pulled up the probate database to verify my marital status for asset classification purposes, a standard procedural step, he assured me, glancing up briefly before returning his attention to the screen. Then he frowned very slightly, the kind of frown that precedes a sentence you will remember the rest of your life.
Miss Ashworth, he said, his tone carefully neutral, I'm showing a finalized divorce decree between you and a Mr. Grant Whitfield, effective 4 months ago. An uncontested filing. Could you confirm this is accurate for our records? I genuinely thought I had misheard him. I'm sorry, what did you just say? He turned his monitor toward me, angling the screen so I could see it clearly. There it was, glowing in plain black and white on a government database, a petition for dissolution of marriage, a waiver of service, a signed marital settlement agreement, complete and fully executed, and at the bottom of every single page, a signature that looked exactly, precisely, unmistakably like mine. The same slight upward flick at the end of the E in Ashworth that I had signed 1,000 times over the course of my adult life, on contracts, on term sheets, on our very own marriage license 9 years earlier. Renata's pen stopped moving mid-word. "Camille," she said quietly, "did you know about this?" My hands had gone cold around the glass of water someone had set in front of me at some point without me noticing. I'm still living with him. We slept in the same bed last night. I pulled out my phone with fingers that didn't feel entirely like my own and scrolled to a text Grant had sent me that very morning. "Don't forget your umbrella, it's pouring. Good luck with the estate stuff today." So thoughtful, so sickeningly casually ordinary. A man who reminds his wife to bring an umbrella because he's worried about the rain, and who has, according to a state court database, been legally divorced from that same wife for 4 months? Renata recovered her composure first, sliding into full professional mode. "Pull the complete docket," she instructed the associate. "Every page, every filing date, every notice address on record." A few minutes later, the printed pages felt like razor blades sliding across the desk toward me. The mailing address listed for all official court notices was Meridian Bio's corporate headquarters, not our home in Belmont, not any address I had ever used for personal correspondence. I thought instantly of Grant's executive assistant, a soft-spoken woman named Yara Delgado, who handled his calendar, his correspondence, and, increasingly it seemed, considerably more than either. Memories began flooding back at a genuinely terrifying speed, the way your brain sometimes assembles a puzzle you didn't even realize you'd been collecting pieces for. Months earlier, right around the time my grandmother's health had begun its final steep decline, Grant had handed me an enormous 3-ring binder of paperwork one exhausted evening after I'd spent 12 hours at the hospital. He called it routine restructuring documents ahead of the FDA pre-submission filing, his voice weary in a way that suggested he, too, had been carrying an unbearable load. I remembered asking, half-heartedly, whether I needed to actually read through all of it. He had smiled, that same warm, patient smile that had once made me fall in love with him over burnt coffee in a university lab, and rubbed my shoulder gently. "Don't you trust me by now, Cam? It's mostly technical addenda for the manufacturing partners. Sign the tabs and I'll walk you through anything important later once things calm down." And I signed. I signed because I was exhausted from back-to-back hospital visits. I signed because I trusted him completely, without reservation, the way you trust the person who held your hand through 3 failed embryo transfers. I signed because after 9 years of marriage, it had genuinely never once occurred to me that I might need to guard myself against my own husband's paperwork. "Camille," Renata said gently, once the shock had settled into something closer to cold, working clarity, "the assets your grandmother left you are explicitly structured as your sole and separate property. Her trust language excludes them entirely from marital commingling, effective on the date of her passing. Legally speaking, the fact that you are currently, technically divorced actually protects this inheritance completely from any claim Grant could ever attempt to make on it." I closed my eyes. In a single 60-minute meeting, I had learned that I had just inherited $40 million, and I had learned that my husband had secretly, legally erased me from his life months earlier, all while sleeping beside me every single night and reminding me that very morning to bring an umbrella in the rain. I didn't scream. I didn't call Grant demanding immediate answers. Something in me went terrifyingly, unnaturally calm instead. The particular kind of calm that arrives only when pain has reached a depth where screaming no longer feels adequate to the occasion. I signed the necessary paperwork for certified copies of everything, thanked Renata with a voice that sounded almost normal, and sat in my car in the parking garage beneath her building for nearly 40 minutes before I trusted my hands enough to turn the key in the ignition. If this story already has your full attention, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people, and I promise you this story only gets more satisfying from here. That afternoon, still sitting in my car, I called Renata's office back and asked her to connect me with a forensic specialist she trusted implicitly, someone discreet, thorough, and entirely unafraid of powerful families. She gave me the number of Priya Nair, a private investigator who had spent nearly a decade doing corporate fraud work for a Big Four accounting firm before striking out on her own, building a small, elite practice just outside Boston that specialized in exactly the kind of quiet, methodical unraveling I now desperately needed. When I explained everything to Priya over coffee near Kendall Square 2 days later, the divorce filing I had never consented to, the mailing address routed through my own company, and a strange, nagging feeling I'd carried for over a year that something in Meridian Bio's vendor accounts didn't quite add up, Priya didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't offer me hollow sympathy. She simply opened a notebook and started writing. "I only work within the law," she told me, her tone matter-of-fact. "Public records, financial paper trails, surveillance conducted entirely in public spaces, no wiretaps, no break-ins, nothing that could compromise a future case. People like this always leave a trail, Camille. They're simply betting that nobody with the resources and the motivation will ever bother to look closely enough to find it. You clearly have both." 2 days later, Priya sent me a short text message with an address attached, a luxury waterfront condominium in Boston's Seaport District, registered under a limited liability company, linked several layers deep to Grant's executive assistant, Yara Delgado. I drove there myself on a gray Thursday afternoon and parked across the street, watching from behind tinted windows as Grant walked out of the building's glass lobby holding hands with Yara and a small boy who couldn't have been older than 2, clutching a stuffed green dinosaur against his chest with the fierce, absent-minded grip of a toddler who has claimed an object as permanently his. Grant knelt down on the wet sidewalk, ignoring the puddles soaking into his tailored trousers, to zip the tiny boy's raincoat with a tenderness I recognized instantly and painfully, the exact same tenderness I had begged him silently, desperately, to show me during every single failed round of IVF, during every quiet drive home from the fertility clinic when neither of us could find anything to say. The boy looked up at him and said something I couldn't hear through the closed car windows, but his small lips clearly, unmistakably formed the word "Dad." My chest went hollow in a way I had never experienced before, a sensation like the floor of a house giving way all at once beneath your feet. I did not get out of the car. I did not confront them on that sidewalk in front of a toddler. I simply sat there, memorizing every detail, until Priya's photographs arrived in my inbox an hour later, documenting everything my own eyes had already burned permanently into memory. That night, I confronted Grant at our home in Belmont, sliding a single printed photograph across our kitchen island without a word of preamble. He looked at it for exactly 1 second too long before his expression rearranged itself into something almost relieved. "Since you know," he said, sitting up straighter on the bar stool, adjusting his tie as though preparing for a business meeting rather than the collapse of their marriage, "Yara gave me a son, Camille. He calls me Dad. All you and I had left at the end was guilt and hormone injections and a house that felt more like an office than a home.
I asked him, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect to be, about the divorce filing. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You signed it," he said flatly, without apology. "It was buried in the restructuring binder, exactly where I put it. It's legally done, Camille. Consider it a mercy, an escape hatch for both of us, frankly, though I understand you're not in a position to see it that way tonight." Then, almost casually, as though the conversation had simply drifted onto an unrelated topic, he walked to his laptop on the kitchen counter and opened Meridian Bio's deployment dashboard, the compound registry, the lab data management system, the entire regulatory submission portal that he had quietly, patiently built himself over the better part of a decade, ensuring, whether by design or simple accumulated habit, that almost all of it ran through his personal credentials alone. "Everything running our FDA pre-submission package goes through me," he said, his voice low, measured, and entirely too pleased with itself. "If I lock this system down before the meeting, the whole submission collapses overnight. Investors walk, the board panics. You'll spend the next 2 years explaining to 110 employees exactly why the company you supposedly built with your own 2 hands died right before its single biggest milestone." He wasn't asking me a question. He was drawing a line in wet concrete and daring me to step over it. I didn't argue with him that night. I told him, in a voice carefully drained of any emotion he might use against me, that I needed time to think everything through. I watched something in his shoulders relax, watched him settle back into the comfortable belief that he had successfully muzzled me with a well-placed threat to the company. He had absolutely no idea that a woman who had been quietly, systematically shamed for her infertility at every single family dinner for 9 consecutive years does not simply cower the first time someone finally raises their voice at her directly. If anything, he had just handed me the single clearest possible confirmation of exactly how deep and how deliberate this betrayal actually ran. The next morning, I met with Priya again in a quiet corner booth of a diner in Somerville, and together we brought in Solomon Reyes, an independent biotech systems security auditor Priya had collaborated with on 2 previous corporate fraud investigations. Solomon was a meticulous, unflappable man in his mid-40s who had spent over a decade hardening critical data infrastructure for pharmaceutical clients across the Northeast, the kind of professional who spoke in careful, precise sentences and rarely raised his voice above a conversational murmur. When I explained the situation to him, a co-founder and CTO actively threatening to sabotage an FDA submission system that he alone controlled as leverage in what was rapidly becoming both a marital and corporate crisis, his expression didn't so much as flicker. "I don't handle marital disputes," he said, stirring his black coffee slowly. "I secure systems. If your husband deliberately built single points of failure into your critical infrastructure, that isn't a marriage problem anymore, Ms. Ashworth. That's a corporate governance failure with a clear technical fix, and fixable problems are the only kind I'm actually interested in." Over the following 2.5 weeks, working out of a small, anonymous rented lab space I quietly leased under an entirely separate subsidiary name, so Grant would have no reason to suspect anything, Solomon and a tight team of 3 additional engineers rebuilt Meridian Bio's authentication architecture from the absolute ground up. They distributed access credentials across multiple independently verified administrators. They stripped out every hidden master key Grant believed only he alone possessed. They installed monitored, tamper-evident audit trails on every single system change, no matter how minor. While that quiet, technical work continued behind the scenes, our lead accountant, a sharp, tireless woman named Denise Okafor, who had been with Meridian Bio since our earliest, most desperate days of chasing seed funding, dug through years of vendor contracts at my private, urgent request. What she eventually uncovered made my stomach turn over completely.
A vendor entity called Whitfield Consulting Group had been paid over $900,000 across 3 fiscal years for vaguely described regulatory advisory services that produced almost no verifiable deliverables Denise could locate anywhere in our project management systems. The registered agent listed on that LLC's incorporation documents was none other than Patricia Whitfield herself, my mother-in-law, the same woman who had spent nearly a decade publicly humiliating me for my infertility at every family gathering, while privately siphoning nearly $1 million from the company I had built with my own 2 hands. Attached to a strikingly similar set of nearly identical invoices was a second vendor entity, Ridgeview Strategic Partners, quietly funneling additional payments toward personal accounts that eventually traced, through several deliberately confusing layers of shell structuring, directly back to Teddy, the golden child brother-in-law I had personally placed on Meridian Bio's payroll out of nothing more than misguided family loyalty and a genuine, if naive, desire to keep peace within Grant's family. Every single approval stamp on both sets of fraudulent invoices carried Grant's own signature, dated and time-stamped with the same careless confidence of a man who had never once imagined anyone would bother to look closely enough to notice. "This isn't just an affair anymore, Camille," Denise told me one evening, sliding the fully annotated spreadsheet across her desk toward me, her voice trembling slightly with an anger she clearly felt on my behalf as much as her own. "He's been quietly bleeding this company dry to fund his mother's entire lifestyle and prop up his brother's endless string of failed ventures for years, Camille, while the rest of us were skipping bonuses to extend our runway." I sat with that number for a very long time after she left the office that night, alone in the dark, staring at figures on a laptop screen. $900,000, money that should have funded another critical clinical trial cohort, another year of well-deserved employee bonuses, another full year of operating runway for the 110 people who had trusted me personally to keep the lights on and the paycheck steady through the leanest years. If you're as invested in this story as I suspect you already are, this is a genuinely great moment to subscribe. There's a brand new revenge story exactly like this one waiting for you every single day, and I promise you don't want to miss what happens next. A few days after Denise's discovery, Patricia showed up unannounced at Meridian Bio's headquarters, dragging Yara and the toddler along with her, apparently attempting to stage a small, sympathetic scene in our glass-walled lobby for the benefit of any employee who happened to be walking past at the wrong moment. She loudly declared, to no one and everyone at once, that I had absolutely no right to freeze any family arrangements, financial or otherwise, and that I was clearly punishing an innocent child for the sins of the adults around him. I let building security handle the situation calmly and without incident, while Renata's office quietly filed a formal cease and desist letter addressing the increasingly public, increasingly reckless claims Patricia had already begun posting across several social media platforms, calling me, among other things, a barren, controlling wife trying to destroy a real family. Ironically, those very posts, time-stamped, screenshotted, and carefully preserved by Priya's Keem before Patricia could quietly delete them, became some of the clearest, most damning evidence we would eventually present, both of the harassment campaign itself and of a startlingly candid public admission regarding the exact financial arrangement we were still quietly, methodically investigating. The next morning, I met with Priya again in a quiet corner booth of a diner in Somerville, and together we brought in Solomon Reyes, an independent biotech systems security auditor Priya had collaborated with on 2 previous corporate fraud investigations. Solomon was a meticulous, unflappable man in his mid-40s who had spent over a decade hardening critical data infrastructure for pharmaceutical clients across the Northeast, the kind of professional who spoke in careful, precise sentences and rarely raised his voice above a conversational murmur. When I explained the situation to him, a co-founder and CTO actively threatening to sabotage an FDA submission system that he alone controlled as leverage in what was rapidly becoming both a marital and corporate crisis, his expression didn't so much as flicker. "I don't handle marital disputes," he said, stirring his black coffee slowly. "I secure systems. If your husband deliberately built single points of failure into your critical infrastructure, that isn't a marriage problem anymore, Ms. Ashworth. That's a corporate governance failure with a clear technical fix, and fixable problems are the only kind I'm actually interested in." Over the following 2.5 weeks, working out of a small, anonymous rented lab space I quietly leased under an entirely separate subsidiary name, so Grant would have no reason to suspect anything, Solomon and a tight team of 3 additional engineers rebuilt Meridian Bio's authentication architecture from the absolute ground up. They distributed access credentials across multiple independently verified administrators. They stripped out every hidden master key Grant believed only he alone possessed. They installed monitored, tamper-evident audit trails on every single system change, no matter how minor. While that quiet, technical work continued behind the scenes, our lead accountant, a sharp, tireless woman named Denise Okafor, who had been with Meridian Bio since our earliest, most desperate days of chasing seed funding, dug through years of vendor contracts at my private, urgent request. What she eventually uncovered made my stomach turn over completely. A vendor entity called Whitfield Consulting Group had been paid over $900,000 across 3 fiscal years for vaguely described regulatory advisory services that produced almost no verifiable deliverables Denise could locate anywhere in our project management systems. The registered agent listed on that LLC's incorporation documents was none other than Patricia Whitfield herself, my mother-in-law, the same woman who had spent nearly a decade publicly humiliating me for my infertility at every family gathering, while privately siphoning nearly $1 million from the company I had built with my own 2 hands. Attached to a strikingly similar set of nearly identical invoices was a second vendor entity, Ridgeview Strategic Partners, quietly funneling additional payments toward personal accounts that eventually traced through several deliberately confusing layers of shell structuring directly back to Teddy, the golden child brother-in-law I had personally placed on Meridian Bio's payroll out of nothing more than misguided family loyalty and a genuine, if naive, desire to keep peace within Grant's family. Every single approval stamp on both sets of fraudulent invoices carried Grant's own signature, dated and time-stamped with the same careless confidence of a man who had never once imagined anyone would bother to look closely enough to notice. "This isn't just an affair anymore, Camille," Denise told me one evening, sliding the fully annotated spreadsheet across her desk toward me, her voice trembling slightly with an anger she clearly felt on my behalf as much as her own. "He's been quietly bleeding this company dry to fund his mother's entire lifestyle and prop up his brother's endless string of failed ventures for years. Years, Camille, while the rest of us were skipping bonuses to extend our runway." I sat with that number for a very long time after she left the office that night, alone in the dark, staring at figures on a laptop screen. $900,000. Money that should have funded another critical clinical trial cohort, another year of well-deserved employee bonuses, another full year of operating runway for the 110 people who had trusted me, personally, to keep the lights on and the paychecks steady through the leanest years. If you're as invested in this story as I suspect you already are, this is a genuinely great moment to subscribe. There's a brand new revenge story exactly like this one waiting for you every single day, and I promise you don't want to miss what happens next.
A few days after Denise's discovery, Patricia showed up entirely unannounced at Meridian Bio's headquarters, dragging Yara and the toddler along with her, apparently attempting to stage a small, sympathetic scene in our glass-walled lobby for the benefit of any employee who happened to be walking past at the wrong moment. She loudly declared to no one and everyone at once that I had absolutely no right to freeze any family arrangements, financial or otherwise, and that I was clearly punishing an innocent child for the sins of the adults around him. I let building security handle the situation calmly and without incident, while Renata's office quietly filed a formal cease and desist letter addressing the increasingly public, increasingly reckless claims Patricia had already begun posting across several social media platforms, calling me, among other things, a barren, controlling wife trying to destroy a real family. Ironically, those very posts, time-stamped, screenshotted, and carefully preserved by Priya's team before Patricia could quietly delete them, became some of the clearest, most damning evidence we would eventually present, both of the harassment campaign itself and of a startlingly candid public admission regarding the exact financial arrangement we were still quietly, methodically investigating. That same week, I finally forced myself to sit down for the family dinner I had been dreading for nearly a month, held at Patricia's sprawling Greenwich estate under the pretense of clearing the air like a proper family. The dining room smelled of roasted lamb and expensive candles, the long mahogany tables set with china that had been in the Whitfield family for 3 generations. Patricia gestured me toward a small folding table set up awkwardly in the corner of the room, near the kitchen door. "Sit there, Camille. The main table is reserved for family tonight." Yara was seated at the head of the main table beside Grant, the toddler perched happily in her lap, gnawing on a dinner roll. I did not sit at the folding table. I remained standing in the center of the room, letting the silence stretch until every single relative present had no choice but to look directly at me. Since we're apparently discussing family arrangements tonight, let's discuss my grandmother's estate while we're at it. I understand there's an expectation floating around this table that I owe Grant, or perhaps this family more broadly, some portion of that inheritance, given everything I supposedly failed to provide over the last 9 years. Patricia's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "A family," I continued, my eyes moving deliberately from Patricia to Grant to Teddy and back again, "is not something you build on fraud. An inheritance my grandmother left specifically and explicitly to protect my granddaughter will never be used to fund a secret condominium, a fabricated child support arrangement, and $900,000 in fraudulent consulting invoices submitted under this family's own name." The room went utterly silent, the kind of silence that has weight and pressure behind it. Grant stood up so quickly his chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. "That's enough, Camille." I looked at him steadily. "You hid a fraudulent divorce filing inside a restructuring binder while I was commuting back and forth from a hospital bed, Grant. You've spent 3 years quietly stealing from a company that employs 110 people who trusted both of us, and you used an innocent toddler tonight as a human shield to make me look unreasonable in front of your entire extended family." I turned to Patricia. "And you enabled every single piece of it, because you've spent your entire life obsessed with which of your 2 sons deserves credit for a bloodline neither of them has actually earned through anything resembling honest effort." I set my napkin down beside my untouched plate. "I am no longer part of this family. My attorneys will be in touch. I'll see the rest of you in court if it comes to that." I walked out of that house into the cold Connecticut evening, leaving behind a dining room frozen in absolute, deafening silence, and I did not look back once. 3 days after that dinner in Greenwich, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, a 617 area code I assumed at first belonged to some persistent vendor or recruiter. I almost let it go to voicemail.
something made me answer instead. The voice on the other end was low, hesitant, clearly working up the courage to say something he had rehearsed several times already. "Ms. Ashworth, this is Wallace Odom. I used to drive for Mr. Whitfield. I quit about 8 months ago. I told everyone it was for a knee surgery, but that wasn't really it." I sat very still, gripping the phone. "I've been watching the news about the company, the board changes, all of it," Wallace continued. "I should have said something a long time ago. I have some things I think you need to see. Can we meet somewhere quiet?" I met Wallace that evening at a nearly empty diner off Route 9 in Newton, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who refilled coffee without being asked. He arrived in a faded Carhartt jacket, a battered gym bag resting on the bench seat beside him, like it contained something fragile. "I was scared of Mr. Whitfield's family for a long time," he admitted, turning a coffee cup slowly between his hands without drinking it. "Not scared like they'd hurt me physically, scared like if I said something, I'd never get hired to drive for anyone with money in this city again. Families like that talk to each other. But watching you take this all on your own in the papers, I figured I'd been a coward long enough." He slid the gym bag across the table. Inside was a small spiral notebook filled with dates, addresses, and times in careful, cramped handwriting, along with a handful of printed photographs and a thumb drive. "I kept a log," he said, "habit from a previous job, doesn't matter why. There were nights Mr. Whitfield told you he was pulling an all-nighter at the lab for a manufacturing audit. My log shows me dropping him at the Seaport condo at 11, picking him back up after 2 in the morning more times than I can count." He tapped a particular page. "And this here, about a year and a half ago, he had me drive him to a print shop in Dorchester, one of those places that does notary services and document prep on the side. He came out with a big envelope, told Ms. Delgado in the car, laughing about it, that the divorce paperwork was basically ready, just needed the right moment to slip in front of you. I didn't think much of it at the time. I do now." My hands had gone cold around my own coffee cup. "Did you ever hear anything about the company's money, vendors, invoices, anything like that?"
Wallace nodded slowly. "Once, maybe 2 years back, I drove Mr. Whitfield and his mother to a lawyer's office downtown, waited outside for almost 2 hours. When they came out, Mrs. Whitfield was in a good mood, talking about how the consulting arrangement would finally take some pressure off the family finances. I didn't know what that meant then. I think I do now, based on what's been in the papers." He pushed the thumb drive toward me. "There's a voicemail on there Mr. Whitfield accidentally left on my phone once, must have butt-dialed me from his jacket pocket. About 4 minutes of him talking to someone, I always assumed his mother, about keeping you busy with the company so you wouldn't look too closely at some of the vendor accounts. I saved it because something about it didn't sit right with me even back then. I just didn't know what to do with it." I thanked Wallace as sincerely as I knew how, and within 48 hours, Priya's team had authenticated every page of his notebook and cross-referenced the timestamps against Meridian Bio's own building access logs, our travel records, and the print shop's own transaction history, which, remarkably, still had the original notarization request on file under Grant's name. The voicemail, once cleaned up by Solomon's team, turned out to be exactly what Wallace remembered. Grant's voice, unmistakable, telling his mother to keep pushing the FDA timeline talk with Camille, give her enough to stay buried in board decks so she doesn't start asking real questions about the consulting invoices until we're further along. It was the single most damning piece of evidence we had gathered to that point. Precisely because it required no interpretation at all. It simply was what it was. Wallace agreed to testify if it ever came to that, on the condition that we help him find steady work afterward, a request I honored happily, eventually connecting him with a small executive transportation company owned by a friend of mine from business school, where he still works today. Some people, it turns out, only need one small act of good faith extended toward them to finally do the right thing after years of quiet complicity born entirely out of fear rather than malice. I understood that better than most people could, having spent 9 years quietly complicit in my own slow erasure, simply because I was too afraid of what asking the real questions might reveal. The morning of Meridian Bio's FDA pre-submission meeting finally arrived, 2 weeks later than originally scheduled, in a downtown Boston conference center packed with agency reviewers, board members, key investors, and members of our own senior leadership team. Solomon's new authentication architecture had been fully deployed and independently stress-tested for nearly 10 days by that point. Grant, apparently still under the mistaken belief that his old master credentials remained functional, attempted to demonstrate his supposed indispensability directly in front of the assembled board just before the meeting formally began, opening his laptop and announcing with theatrical gravity that he had identified a critical security vulnerability requiring him to immediately initiate an emergency system lockdown for everyone's protection. He hammered the enter key with visible confidence. The system returned a simple, calm, entirely unglamorous message across his screen. Access revoked. Please contact your system administrator. His face went completely, visibly bloodless in front of the entire board of directors, several of whom exchanged quiet, uncomfortable glances. I stood and calmly presented the full forensic accounting report myself, walking the board through the Whitfield Consulting Group payments, the Ridgeview Strategic Partners transfers, and the unmistakable timeline connecting those fraudulent payments to the Seaport condominium purchase and the toddler's enrollment at an exclusive private school. I presented the fraudulent divorce filing itself, along with the falsified court notice mailing address quietly routed through our own corporate mailroom. I presented Solomon's detailed technical testimony regarding the single point of failure architecture Grant deliberately, patiently constructed over years, specifically so that he alone could ever hold the entire company hostage at a moment of maximum leverage. The board voted unanimously, without a single dissenting voice, to remove Grant from all officer positions effective immediately, and to suspend all further payments to both Whitfield Consulting Group and Ridgeview Strategic Partners pending a complete, independent legal review. In the weeks immediately following the board's unanimous vote, I made a point of personally addressing Meridian Bio's entire staff in a company-wide meeting, rather than leaving them to piece the story together from fragments and rumor. I stood in front of 110 people who had trusted me with their careers, their mortgages, their family's financial security, and I told them as plainly and honestly as I could exactly what had happened, without dramatizing any of it further than the facts already warranted. I told them the science remained sound, the FDA relationship remained intact, and the company's finances, while bruised, were fully accounted for and fully protected going forward, under a governance structure none of us would ever again allow a single person to quietly circumvent. Several employees came up to me afterward, some in tears, thanking me for the transparency, rather than a carefully worded press release designed to minimize liability. One senior scientist, a woman named Farah, who had joined Meridian Bio in our earliest, most desperate days, hugged me in the hallway and said simply, "We already knew something was wrong. We just didn't know it was this bad. Thank you for not making us guess." That single sentence stayed with me longer than almost anything a board member or investor ever said to me throughout the entire ordeal. Patricia lost her steady monthly consulting income literally overnight. Teddy, confronted directly with an audit trail demonstrating almost no genuine, verifiable work product across 3 full fiscal years of steady payments, was quietly and permanently removed from Meridian Bio's payroll, and later named as a formal defendant in the civil suit filed to recover the misappropriated company funds. Yara, in a twist none of us had fully anticipated, turned out to have been quietly extorting Grant herself for increasingly larger monthly payments by repeatedly threatening to go public with the details of the affair before the critical FDA meeting could take place. a fact that emerged only when Priya's investigators uncovered a separate, entirely independent paper trail, revealing that even Grant's own supposed partner in deception had the entire time been running her own private angle against him. The fraudulent divorce Grant had secretly filed, once properly and thoroughly reviewed by Renata's legal team, was formally contested in family court and ultimately vacated for fraud upon the court, having been filed entirely without my knowledge or informed consent, using a signature obtained through calculated deception buried inside a stack of unrelated corporate restructuring paperwork. A new, entirely legitimate divorce proceeding was subsequently filed in its place, this time with me fully aware, fully informed, and fully legally protected throughout every step of the process, my grandmother's $40 million inheritance shielded completely as my sole and separate property from the very first moment, exactly as she carefully, deliberately intended when she wrote that trust language years before any of this catastrophic betrayal had ever even begun to take shape. The rescheduled FDA pre-submission meeting itself proceeded successfully under Meridian Bio's new leadership structure and a fully secured, independently audited data infrastructure. The agency reviewers raised no significant concerns regarding our data integrity, a small but deeply meaningful victory after everything that happened behind the scenes in the weeks leading up to it. Solomon accepted a permanent position as our head of systems security, a role he approached with the exact same quiet, unglamorous, methodical competence he had demonstrated from the very first day I met him in that Somerville diner. Denise was formally promoted to Chief Financial Officer, a promotion long overdue and richly, unquestionably earned. I never once had to explain to our 110 employees why the company they had believed in for years had suddenly and catastrophically collapsed, because it never did. It bent badly, dangerously in the middle of that storm, but it never broke. Before any of that litigation reached its final resolution, there was a deposition I will never fully forget, held in a nondescript conference room on the 9th floor of Renata's firm, the kind of room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a parking garage rather than anything scenic, as though the building itself understood that nothing beautiful should distract from the business of extracting truth under oath. Grant sat across from me, flanked by an attorney who looked considerably more exhausted than the confident, expensive counsel his family had originally retained. Inez, our new general counsel, walked Grant through the Whitfield Consulting Group invoices one by one, methodically, without raising her voice, in the particular flat, patient tone attorneys use when they already know exactly where every question is going to lead. Mr. Whitfield, can you describe the specific regulatory advisory services Whitfield Consulting Group provided to Meridian Bio in exchange for this payment, dated March of the year in question? Grant's eyes flicked toward his attorney before he answered, a habit I recognized instantly from years of watching him hedge in board meetings whenever he hadn't fully prepared an answer.
"I would need to review the file to speak to the specifics," he said carefully. Inez slid the file across the table. "Please, take your time." The silence that followed stretched long enough that even Grant's own attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. When Grant finally spoke again, his voice had lost most of his usual polish. My mother had experience in regulatory strategy from her time on nonprofit boards. I believed the arrangement was legitimate at the time. Inez didn't blink. "Was your mother ever registered as a regulatory consultant with any relevant professional body, Mr. Whitfield?" Another long pause. "No." "Did Whitfield Consulting Group produce a single written work product Meridian Bio's regulatory team ever actually used in any FDA filing?" Grant looked down at the table. "Not that I'm aware." It was, in its own quiet way, the moment I finally understood the entire scheme had collapsed not because of any single dramatic confrontation, but because of exactly this kind of patient, unglamorous accumulation of small, unanswerable questions, asked one after another until there was simply nowhere left to hide.
Patricia's own deposition, held the following week, proved considerably more combative. She arrived in a tailored navy suit, clearly determined to project the same effortless authority she had wielded at every family dinner for as long as I had known her. That authority lasted almost exactly 11 minutes. When Inez produced the print shop receipt Wallace had helped us authenticate, showing Patricia's own signature on a notarization request dated nearly 2 years before the divorce filing ever surfaced, Patricia's composure finally cracked in a way I had genuinely never witnessed before. "I was simply trying to protect my son's interests," she said, her voice rising slightly. "A mother is entitled to look out for her family." Inez asked quietly and without any particular heat, "Was Camille Ashworth part of that family you were looking out for, Mrs. Whitfield?" Patricia had no answer for that at all. The court reporter's keys fell silent for what felt like an extraordinarily long time before the deposition finally resumed. The civil litigation against Patricia, Teddy, and Grant jointly moved forward over the following year, running parallel to the criminal referral our attorneys made regarding the wire fraud and falsified corporate documents. Grant ultimately accepted a plea agreement rather than face a lengthy public trial, agreeing to full financial restitution alongside a period of probation. His once promising career in biotechnology effectively and permanently ended the moment his name became inseparably linked in every professional circle that mattered with fraud, embezzlement, and the calculated betrayal of the very company that had made his career possible in the first place. Patricia settled the civil claims against her rather than risk her own remaining reputation and assets in open court, quietly liquidating a portion of her own considerable personal trust to satisfy the judgment. Teddy, without his mother's protection or his brother's cover, found himself facing consequences entirely of his own making, for what felt, to him at least, like the very first time in his privileged, cushioned life. Months later, standing alone at the window of my new corner office overlooking the slow, steady curve of the Charles River, I found myself thinking back to that gray, rain-soaked morning in Renata's office when I had learned I inherited a fortune and lost a marriage in the very same breath, within the very same 60 minutes. I had thought, in that raw, disorienting moment, that my entire life had simply shattered beyond any hope of repair. It hadn't shattered at all, I eventually came to understand. It had simply, finally, been unmasked for exactly what it had already quietly become long before I ever noticed. I used a meaningful portion of my grandmother's inheritance to establish a legal defense fund specifically for women defrauded through hidden divorce filings and coerced signatures buried inside unrelated paperwork, a small but deliberate way of transforming what had been done to me into something that might genuinely protect someone else standing exactly where I once stood, confused and disoriented in a lawyer's office, holding a stack of papers she never remembered signing. Kindness offered without any boundaries at all, I had learned, in the hardest, most expensive way imaginable, is simply a ladder for people who were never once planning to climb it honestly, and trust placed carelessly, however lovingly, in the wrong hands, is nothing more than a knife you hand someone else to hold against your own throat. I was no longer willing, under any circumstances, to hand that particular knife to anyone ever again. Before we get to how this all wrapped up, I want to say thank you again for sticking with this story all the way through. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button now, because tomorrow brings a brand new story just as gripping as this one, and I'd genuinely love to have you back here for it. In the year that followed, Meridian Bio's oncology program advanced further and faster than any of us had dared to project even in our most optimistic board decks. We closed a new partnership with a mid-size pharmaceutical company that had been circling us cautiously for 2 years, waiting, we later learned, to see how the internal turbulence at the company would ultimately resolve itself before committing real capital.
Once the dust settled and our new, decentralized leadership structure proved itself resilient under exactly the kind of pressure that would have crushed a company with a single point of failure at its core, that partnership finally closed, bringing with it not just capital, but genuine scientific validation of years of quiet, unglamorous work. I hired a new general counsel, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Inez Delacroix, who had spent a decade untangling exactly this flavor of corporate fraud at a much larger firm, before deciding she wanted smaller, more personal cases where she could actually see the impact of her work. Together, we rewrote Meridian Bio's entire governance charter from the ground up, building in redundant approval chains for any vendor relationship involving a family member of an executive, mandatory quarterly independent audits regardless of company size, and a whistleblower protection policy robust enough that any future Denise O'Coffer would never have to quietly, nervously dig through years of suspicious invoices entirely on her own initiative, hoping she wasn't overstepping some invisible line. I also, slowly and with considerably more caution than I had ever extended to another human being in my adult life, began rebuilding something resembling a personal life outside the walls of the company. I reconnected with college friends I had let drift away during the exhausting, all-consuming years of fertility treatments and fundraising rounds. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in exactly the particular flavor of betrayal trauma I was carrying, someone who helped me understand, gently but firmly, that none of what had happened to me was in any way a referendum on my own worth, my own body, or my own judgment, however many nights I had privately, silently wondered otherwise. I began cautiously to consider what it might eventually look like to trust someone again, not out of an urgent need to fill the space Grant had left behind, but simply because I refused to let his betrayal be the final word on what love and partnership could still mean for me. Patricia, in the aftermath of everything, largely disappeared from public view, her once formidable social standing in Greenwich quietly diminished by a scandal that, despite everyone's best efforts at discretion, had eventually made its way through the tightly wound gossip networks of Old Money, Connecticut. Teddy, stripped of both his mother's financial cushion and his brother's institutional cover for the very first time in his life, took a genuine entry-level job at a logistics company outside Hartford, a development that struck several people who had known the family for years as nothing short of miraculous. Whether it represented real, lasting change or simply a temporary adjustment born of necessity, none of us could say with any certainty, and frankly, it was no longer my responsibility to track or to care. Grant, for his part, reached out to me exactly once, nearly a year after everything had concluded, through a brief, carefully worded email that neither apologized outright nor attempted to justify anything, but simply asked whether I might ever consider speaking with him again someday. I read it twice, sitting alone in my quiet Belmont kitchen, the same kitchen where he had once slid his laptop toward me and threatened to collapse everything I'd built rather than face the consequences of his own choices. I did not reply. Some doors, I had come to understand, are not meant to be reopened simply because enough time has passed to make the request feel reasonable again. Some silences are their own complete and sufficient answer. On what would have been our 10th wedding anniversary, a date that arrived quietly, almost without me noticing until it had already passed, I found myself instead at my grandmother's grave in a small tree-lined cemetery outside Providence, laying a single bouquet of white peonies against her modest granite headstone. "I'm sorry it took losing everything to finally see clearly, Grandma," I said quietly, kneeling on the damp autumn grass. "But I promise you, I took it all back, every last piece of it." The wind moved gently through the maple trees overhead, scattering a few early fallen leaves across the headstones nearby, and for the first time in what felt like years,
I breathed out something that resembled genuine, uncomplicated peace, rather than merely the absence of immediate crisis. This is the story of a woman who spent nearly a decade building a company beside the husband she believed was her equal partner in absolutely everything, only to learn, in the quiet, unremarkable office of a probate attorney, that her marriage had already been secretly, legally dissolved months earlier without her knowledge or consent. Shamed relentlessly for her infertility by a toxic mother-in-law who openly, unapologetically favored her golden child younger son, and blindsided by a hidden years-long embezzlement scheme quietly funneling company funds toward a secret second family, she did not break under the accumulated weight of it all. She went quiet instead, methodical, patient, utterly unstoppable in the specific, unglamorous way that only comes from someone who has finally, completely stopped waiting for anyone else's permission to protect herself. Kindness without boundaries, in the end, is simply a ladder for the ungrateful to climb over you, and trust placed carelessly in the wrong hands is nothing more than a knife you willingly hand someone else, hilt first, and then act surprised when they eventually decide to use it. Sometimes, late in the evening, after the office has emptied out and the only sound left in the building is the hum of the HVAC system cycling through its quiet, mechanical rhythm, I think about the version of myself who sat frozen in Renata's office that rainy morning, certain that her entire life had just ended in the space of a single sentence. I wish I could tell her, somehow, that the ending she feared was actually a beginning she couldn't yet recognize. I wish I could tell her that the same hands that had spent 9 years signing whatever was placed in front of her out of exhausted trust would eventually learn to read every single word of every single page, out loud if necessary, before ever picking up a pen again. I wish I could tell her that the quiet, unglamorous work of hiring the right investigator, the right accountant, the right systems auditor, and the right attorney would ultimately matter far more than any single dramatic confrontation ever could, however satisfying those confrontations sometimes felt in the moment. Meridian Bio, 3 years later, employs just over 200 people across 2 sites, has advanced its lead oncology compound into a second clinical trial phase, and operates under a governance structure other founders now occasionally ask me to help them replicate at their own companies, a request I find quietly, deeply satisfying every single time it comes up. I still keep a framed copy of my grandmother's handwritten note tucked into the original probate folder Renata gave me that first devastating morning, sitting on the corner of my desk where I can see it every day. It reads in her small, precise handwriting, "Protect what you build, Camille, especially from the people closest to you who assume they're entitled to it. Love freely, trust carefully. Never confuse the two." I didn't fully understand what she meant when she wrote it. I understand it completely now, and I suspect I always will. If there is one thing I would want another woman sitting exactly where I once sat, holding papers she doesn't remember signing, to carry away from everything that happened to me, it would simply be this: your calm is not weakness, and your patience is not surrender. The quietest, steadiest people in any room are very often the ones already building the case that will eventually take everything back. Thank you so much for staying with me through today's story. If it made you angry, made you cheer, or made you think of someone in your own life, please leave a comment below. I read every single one, and they truly mean so much to me. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. I'll see you right back here tomorrow for another story. Take care of yourselves, and I'll meet you in the next one.